So it's been a little while since I did a track deconstruction on this channel, but I've got a brand new release out at the moment, a new remix for Marc Cotterell. The track's called All Night, and if you want to help support it, I'll put a link up there and in the description below. But in this video today, I thought I'd take you through exactly how I made it. So let's jump into Ableton. Okay, so if you haven't heard this remix yet, here's a quick blast of how the final version sounds. Okay, so let's dive into this remix, and I think the first thing we'll have a look at is the actual stems that came through, the things that were actually sent to me, the remix parts, and what I actually used, because it's always kind of interesting to know what parts are used for a remix. And generally when I get stems sent through to me, remix parts sent through to me, I usually always go with the vocal. That's usually the main thing that I usually go for. So when I'm looking through the stems, the vocal is usually the first thing I ever listen to. So this is kind of the original vocal. You can actually see here, it's actually labeled up as At Night. I think the original track was called At Night, and now it's been put out as All Night. I think it was changed just before it was released. So yeah, as you can hear the vocal there, if you've heard my remix, then you'll kind of know that I've almost doubled the speed of that vocal. And I think when I kind of was auditioning that vocal, I was thinking it was just a little bit too slow, so I almost kind of double timed it. There's some other stuff within here, and I don't tend to use the musical parts that often unless they're really kind of key to the track. So we've got an ARP sound in here. And I just don't think that would actually fit with my kind of music. Then we got the bass. Now I kind of use some of the notes from this bass because obviously that's kind of key of the track, and I kind of based around some of my remix around the notes of the bass. There's actually a bass MIDI here, so that which you don't usually get with most remix parts. A lot of producers don't tend to save out the MIDI. It's really handy when they do. Obviously it gives you the notes that they've used for the original track, so you can actually match yours better to it. So it kind of complements the original. So you're not kind of guessing at what chord it's in, what scale it's in, and all that kind of stuff. Then we got a whole load of different effects here, which again I'm not going to use. I'm going to put my own effects on there. Hats, any kind of drum parts. Again, my sound is very much my drums and my bass and stuff, so I'm probably not going to use any parts from the original. Got this Jupiter synth here. It's really cool. It's a really kind of jazzy kind of sound, but it's not kind of what I wanted for my remix. Again, effects. We've got an M1 organ in here. So if you know me, I tend to use M1 organ quite a bit in my tracks. So being as the original had an M1 organ in there, I didn't want to kind of replicate that within my remix. I wanted to kind of give it a different kind of slant, a little kind of different taste. Then we got the main string. Again, something I didn't think I was going to use. We got an organ in there, shaker, and a few other little bits here. And I generally went through this and thought, well, there wasn't too much in there that I really wanted to use for my remix. When I come to a remix, usually it's always the vocal I go for, and then I build everything around that, mainly because I don't want to kind of create a carbon copy of the original track. I want my remix to kind of have a really different kind of feel. So that's why I usually use the vocal. So talking to the vocals, let's have a look at the vocals first and what I've done with that. So you can see here, I've got the vocals here. If I double click into this, I don't think I've even consolidated it. No, so we've got the original kind of vocal part here. You can see it's exactly the same as that preview that I just showed you. And I've actually kind of taken that loop region right down. So it's actually just looping a very small part of it. I've also put these warp markers in as well, just to kind of, I guess, adjust the timing slightly of it. I think it was just slightly out of time for what I wanted to do with it. So this is how this sounds. So it's almost kind of, yeah, it's double time. So if I go to stretch it out to the length that it would normally be. And I just wanted to make it even tighter. I wanted this kind of loop, this kind of monotonous, I don't know, some groove going through there, and the vocal really does that. It kind of is the main part of the track that really kind of makes everything go along. As far as the effects goes, I've got an EQ8 on there, which is just doing some gentle EQing. Got rid of the bottom frequencies on that and just cut a little bit of the mid range. Of course, I've got the remix parts through, and usually the remix parts, obviously, if you've got the vocal coming through, then it's probably already been processed. So it's got a lot of kind of processing on it already. Hopefully, it's all been decently EQ'd. Even if you get like the dry a cappella through or vocal parts through, they've usually had some treatment done to them. So most of the time they're fine when they come through. So that's why I've only done some light EQing on it. I've got an auto filter here, which is actually kind of, it fades the vocal in. Actually, I think at the start I've actually just used the utility, but I'm actually kind of automating the frequency of the filter going through it. It's a trick I just love to do, using that auto filter and just automating that frequency. I've got a reverb actually on the track. Normally on for vocals and stuff, you'd probably put the reverb on ascend, but I like kind of putting it on the actual track itself, mainly because I whack it up to about 40-50%. And what you get is then 40% or 50% of the original signal, and then 40-50% of the wet signal, and you kind of mixing them both in. It makes the kind of vocal pull back a little bit, and I just find that kind of works better for me. Rather than having the full vocal and then adding reverb on the top, I like to kind of push that vocal back a bit, and it just makes it feel, I don't know, part of the track. Then I've got the LFO tool on there, which is just gently sidechaining. In fact, actually, that's quite a harsh sidechain for the vocal, but I think because the vocal is this kind of, it's this loop, it's this kind of melody in itself, that's why it doesn't matter too much that I've actually got that really kind of strong sidechain on it. It's kind of adds to that groove anyway. And I've just got that kind of, that sidechain going, obviously, whenever the beats are going. In fact, actually, I've got it going when the beats aren't going there, but anyway, it's added to the effect. So that's why I've got the LFO tool in there. And the utility, as I kind of showed you there, it's kind of got some automation where I'm just fading that in. I always automate the volume on a utility rather than actually on the track itself, because then you can go ahead and you can, do the levels afterwards. So I can adjust the levels of that vocal whenever I want to without, messing up any automation. So that's kind of the vocals. The vocals, it started with the vocals and I kind of work from there. And usually, obviously, I would build up my drums. I usually come up with some really rough drums to start with, and then I kind of base the melody around that. So let me find a decent part of this track, probably a main part of this track, and we'll go through all the different layers. So these are the drums. I've actually got the drums grouped as a drums group, and then inside that drums group, I've got a kick, and then I've got my tops loops. This is all my top drums. I kind of always go through, if you've seen any of my videos, I kind of use a lot of samples. I don't tend to use MIDI all that much. Every now and again, I will use MIDI if I need to, if that's what I'm going for. But generally, I always use samples and then consolidate them. So you'll see a lot of kind of loops that I've used, and I've kind of cut stuff out. Like this clap probably came from a loop that had, other stuff around it, but I've just consolidated just that clap. So yeah, this is how the drums are all sounding together. That kick is quite high in the mix, actually. I tend to put a lot of emphasis on the kick within my tracks, as you'll probably notice if you know my tracks. So for the kick here, I've just got a decent kick, a decent kick sample. Once you've got a decent kick sample, you don't need to do much with it, because if it's not a great sample to start with, then you don't need to do a lot. Then you need to do a lot of kind of processing on it to make it decent. Whereas this one is a pretty decent one already, but I've used the drum bus just to add a bit of boom to it. So the boom is kind of adding some bottom frequencies, adding a bit of weight to it. So that's why I've kind of used it on this. I don't tend to use the drum bus too much, because by default, even with everything kind of turned off or everything kind of reduced to its minimum, it still has too much of an effect. I would like to be able to just add that boom onto it without adding the drive and the other compression and stuff like that. So I've kind of played around with a lot of settings within here. I'm not quite sure, how and why I've done a lot of that. It's just kind of playing around. So this is what it sounds like without the drum bus on. So as you can hear from there, there's quite a bit of drive going into there, a bit of boom. In fact, you can see if I turn that off, it's actually going in there quite hot. You can see it's coming out like real red, but it doesn't matter too much for my sound, because I'm going for that kind of gritty kind of effect anyway. Sometimes I will push these samples so they are redlining, just so I get that little bit of distortion or whatever. It doesn't always work, but for this it didn't. I kind of run it through the drum bus like that. So I run it hot into the drum bus, and yeah, it just gave me something more than if I wasn't redlining it. I don't know. I play around with these things, and if it works, then I don't question it. And if it is redlining, I use my ears and kind of figure out whether that sounds bad or it sounds good. And if it sounds good, then I don't worry about it. I don't worry about the fact that it's redlining or whatever if it sounds decent. So going to the EQ, I've got the Neutron 3 equalizer. I tend to use this equalizer a lot on the kicks, because I also use the Neutron 3 on my bass, and I tend to use the masking feature, so I kind of figure out where the frequencies are conflicting. That's generally why I use the equalizer on the kick. I've only took a little bit out of the bottom end here, so you can see I've only got a cut here about 34 hertz, which is really quite low. It's really just getting rid of those sub frequencies that are not needed. Everything else is hard, as you can see here. There's hardly any. Well, there's nothing kind of EQ in here. I haven't kind of put any top shelf on there or anything else like that. That drum kick was just good enough, and with the drum bus, it just kind of worked. I've got a utility on there as well, but it's not being used. It's just in case I want to do something with it. In fact, I've got a 2 dB gain there, I think, which I probably used at some point, but I didn't need after that. So let's go into the tops loop, and let's first talk about the group of the tops. So the group of the tops is actually all kind of, it's running through decimal. So I've got this kind of, I love this ASR 10 preset. Yeah, I'm not even quite sure where that comes from, but I just like that preset. That preset works quite nicely for me. So that's why I've kind of got that on there. I've also got a compressor on here, which again is just putting some gentle kind of compression on there. I could have used a glue compressor, but I honestly, this time I just put a normal compressor on there, adjusted the threshold down a bit, and I think pretty much most of the other settings within here are default, so I haven't really done much with it. EQ 8 is on there, but I'm not quite sure why. I think I put a little bit of a duck just here. Yeah, there's a tiny little bit of kind of reduction here, but that's just really subtle. And then I've got the ozone imager, which is just giving some width to the top end. So if I solo these tops, you can kind of hear the effects with these things on them. So let's see what it sounds like dry. The decimal just adds a little bit of kind of grittiness to it, almost just a little bit of dirt to it. And then the compressor. Just kind of squeezes it together a little bit. And then I've got a bit of the EQ8, which you're probably not going to hear anyway. That was really just me just tweaking it just slightly. So you're probably not going to hear that through headphones or anything else like that. It's really kind of subtle change. Then that ozone imager is really just throwing out, kind of making those top frequencies wide. As you can see here, I've got the very first band here, the topmost kind of band, putting loads of kind of stereo imaging on that, a little bit less on the one after that, and then I'm kind of really narrowing it on the bottom frequencies. There's probably nothing coming through this bottom frequency, but I want to make sure if there is anything kind of leaking through there, that obviously is coming through, then I want to make sure that's mono, because I just want to make things as clear as possible. So yeah, that's kind of what my Top's group is sounding like. As for what's in there, we've got the clap within here. So just a simple clap. I think it's a 909 clap. Just a really kind of, just a snare, kind of clap snare happening. And there's a little tiny little bit of something within there. This came from a top loop. I think it's a UK garage one by the looks of it, by the file name. So it's probably got a whole lot of other bits that I had within here, but I just cut it out. So I only really had that snare in there and just this tiny little noise. So there's probably hi-hats and stuff like that in there, but I got rid of all that stuff because I don't want all that. Then I've got this main hat, which is probably one of my usual kind of sloshy kind of hats. Yeah, it just gives it that kind of housey kind of sound. Then we got a tom kind of sound, again, probably cut out from a tops loop. A really subtle sound. I'm not even quite sure what. I don't usually put toms in there. Sometimes I will do. This time it just kind of worked. Got a snare. Yeah, it's kind of a little snare sound in there. Then I got some more snares. This is probably more of a top loop. Oh, I've got clip automation going on here. So there you go. You can see literally just that little snare and a couple of snares here. So I haven't even consolidated this one. This is why it kind of looks a little bit more busy, but I'm actually just using those two little bits within there. And then I've got a ride within here. This is being used quite fully, but I've also got the LFO tool there, which is actually kind of ducking a little bit. So it just kind of makes it pump a little bit more. Yeah, so it just makes it pump, and I usually do that on kind of my rides and stuff just to make it fit a bit more with the track. So that's kind of how the drums are sounding, and that's kind of, I put them all together. I probably put a rough version of the drums together first and then come up with the melodies and work with them. But that's how the drums are sounding, when they're finished. So next up is the bass, and as I say, when I was looking at the stems, I actually started off with this bass MIDI file. I think I used the bass MIDI file from the remix parts just to get the notes, but I kind of changed it up a bit. I kind of got my own kind of rhythm going within there. So the bass sounds a little bit like this. So yeah, it's I'm not quite sure how I came up with those notes. I think probably in combination with the chords as well, because the chords are on exactly the same notes as the bass. So I've kind of reinforced the both of them. So obviously the bass is giving weight to those chords. So the bass is, I've got a C minor preset on there for the scale, but I've obviously adjusted it to B. The track is in B minor, so I've adjusted that so it's now all in B minor, just so I can play around with the notes within here. I usually kind of play around with the notes and see what sounds kind of cool, and then I don't have to worry, what note it's landing on, because this is making sure that it's within that B minor scale. Then I have actually just a sampled bass note. I think this is from the Left Wing and Cody pack of their sample pack is amazing. I think it was on Loop Masters. I'm pretty sure it was on Loop Masters, and they got some great bass stabs within there, and it's just a really simple bass stab. If I turn the LFO tool off, you can hear how it sounds. I didn't really kind of move that far with the notes. You can see within here, they really don't move far within the octave. So the fact that I'm using just a single bass note and like resampling it up and down a little bit, it's not going much more than about 4 semitones within there, maybe. That's the furthest it's kind of moving. So yeah, I'm not really stretching it too far that I'm actually going to notice a real kind of problem with that kind of bass, just having that single bass sample rather than having a multi-sample. So it kind of worked in this case. It worked quite well. I've also got the Neutron within here, and I'm guessing, yes, I have used the mix assistant within here. So the mix assistant, I run it on my bass. It will kind of give me some suggestions as to how to make this bass sound better. So we've got this Sculptor. The Sculptor is this new module that came within Neutron 3, which adds more bassness. I don't really know what it does. The sculptor just basically, you've got a whole load of presets within here. Again, the mix assistant kind of chooses this based on what you tell it is. So it's gone on the bass preset, and based on this preset, it kind of enhances certain frequencies that make the bass sound better. I think it's just common EQ stuff that an engineer would usually do on a bass, and I think it's just a kind of quick preset. But anyway, that I probably left that as default because it's sounding pretty good. I probably would have played around with it just to make sure that I could make it better, but honestly, it probably made it pretty good to start with. Then we got the EQ here. Now, there are a few different bands within here. A few of these it probably already made, but I can already tell from this that I would have put in a low sweep, a low shelf. So just cutting some of the bottom end out. I've cut up to about 44 hertz. Sometimes I would cut a little bit higher than that. But because the kick is quite weighty, I wanted to kind of not match that with the bass, but I wanted to make sure that the bass kind of kept up with it almost, but also kept out of the way, of course. And then I also took out quite a bit at the top end as well, because obviously this Neutron ran it through and it was like, yeah, this would sound great if you put like a boost on the top end. And I was like, well, no, I want the top end cut out. So I wanted it kind of dubby almost. And because I've got the keys playing at the top end at the same time, there was no need to kind of have that bass high up. And then it's added a couple of compressors on here as well, which again, it's doing what it's doing and it sounded good with them on. I always turn the exciter off. For some reason, I just don't like the exciter within here. So yeah, that's kind of how it all EQ'd that. As I say, I'm really kind of basic when it comes to that kind of stuff. Neutron 3 does a great job and I just kind of tweak it from there. LFO tool on, which is again ducking the bass out of the way of the kick. I don't really need to go through this, to be honest. I think most of you watching this probably know what sidechaining is, and this is just ducking the kick, so it makes sure that that bass gets out of the way. It's a real kind of deep kind of cut, so it makes sure that because that kick is quite bassy, you know, there's no kind of bass playing at that moment in time. So yeah, that's my LFO tool. It's ducking out of the way. I've also got a bit of automation here on the bass. Yeah, so in the breakdown, the bass kind of fades out a little bit. Nothing amazing really. It's just in the breakdown, I kind of just, as it's kind of slowing down in that breakdown, I just wanted to take the bass down in volume really. So it kind of just gently fades out. So that's kind of what I've done with the bass. And because we're talking about the bass, I'm going to talk about the keys as well, because these kind of match up. These are exactly the same notes. So you can see here, if I kind of solo this here, you can see that the keys are playing exactly the same notes as the bass. And let me try playing them both together so you can see what I mean. So let's solo the keys and the bass. So yeah, they kind of complement each other. A lot of the time I will use kind of the keys on the same notes as the bass and vice versa, because it just emphasizes everything. It kind of really makes it quite impactful, and that bass kind of gives weight to those keys. So with the keys, as I say, pretty much the same notes as the bass. I'm not quite sure what came first, whether it was the keys or the bass. I suspect probably the keys actually came first, and then I added the bass underneath that. But you can see within here, I've got that same scale preset, so the B minor scale, making sure that I keep within that. And then next up, I have the chord device, which is playing a minor ninth chord, but actually it's a slight inversion of that. I'm not quite sure how I came up with this one or where I found it, but this is one I tend to use quite a bit. I've called it the magic kind of minor ninth chord because it just has a great sound, especially for kind of garage kind of sound. So yeah, it kind of works. It's a minor ninth, but it's kind of inverted almost. So yeah, it's one of those ones that I tend to use quite a bit. And then I've got Velvet, which if you've seen any of my videos before, I tend to use quite a lot. This is my Rhodes instrument of choice. I know a lot of people on my channel keep saying about, I think it was Lizard Lounge or whatever it's called. They use that for Rhodes, and I know Native Instruments does a great one. But to be honest, I bought Velvet years ago, absolutely years ago, and I've had no reason to kind of change it out because I just love the kind of sound that comes from it. And there's just so many different presets that when I come to use it each time, I can be using a different preset and it kind of sounds like a completely different sound. And yeah, I really love that. Again, I've got Neutron on here, which I would have run it through the mix assistant again, just to make sure that because it's a Rhodes sound, it kind of has resonance sometimes that kind of doesn't sound quite great, especially around the kind of the low mids. So that's why I always run Neutron through it just to make sure that it kind of catches all that kind of stuff. But even with this, you can see there's a kind of a duck here, a cut, sorry, around about, what was it, 175 hertz. Even though that, I think probably Neutron did that, I've actually scooped it all out on a flat high pass. So I've really got rid of a lot of that bottom end because, well, I didn't need it because I got the bass in there as well. The bass is taking care of the low end, and because the bass has some top end, they kind of cross over a bit. So I was able to scoop quite a bit of that Rhodes out at the bottom end, which kind of got rid of a lot of my issues. Now I've got a big kind of boost here, and a boost here you can kind of see on this kind of high shelf, which is kind of boosting a lot of this kind of top end. This is going for an effect rather than necessarily fixing anything. I'm actually kind of going for a more kind of harsh effect on the Rhodes, and then that's just something I put in on my own because I think it sounds kind of cool. I often kind of do this kind of exaggerated top shelf, and that kind of works for me most times. Sometimes it can sound not so great, but in this case it did. Then I've also got an auto filter. Again, I'm automating the auto filter, so probably in the breakdown. Yep, so we're getting rid of some of the top end on that Rhodes sound. So this is kind of what it sounds like. So right there, I could have just had the bass playing on its own, but to be honest, the bass sounded a bit too garagey, or a bit too kind of, and I'm not quite sure. It wasn't the kind of effect that I wanted. It was losing that soulfulness. So I kind of, rather than taking the Rhodes completely out, I kind of got rid of some of the top end of that. So kind of scooping out that, using a low pass filter just to kind of get rid of some of that top end. And that kind of worked for me. That kind of worked really well. I've got a boost here on the utility, just a flat 2 dB boost, probably just because it sounded too quiet. I wanted to boost it up a little bit. And then I've got a reverb on here. Again, actually on the channel because I just like the effect that it does. I've got rid of the low cut on the reverb just so I've not got loads of kind of low end kind of rumble reverb muddiness. So that's why I've kind of got the low cut on the reverb there. And then we've got the LFO tool in there as well, which again is kind of ducking the kick. Not as quite as extreme as the bass because, well, it's not, in this case, it's not necessarily done for the frequencies to stop clashing. It's more done for a dramatic effect, that kind of pumping effect. So it's not a surgical thing that I'm doing with the LFO tool on the keys. It's more a case I want that kind of pumping sound whenever the kick hits. I want it to really kind of feel, when you feel that kick punch through, I want everything to kind of get out of its way so it really kind of has that effect. You'll probably notice that with my tracks anyway. So that is kind of the most part, that is the main part of the track. You have the keys, the bass, the drums and everything else like that. And the vocal obviously sits along top of that. And then it's just a case of all the nice kind of makeup stuff. Like I've got the vinyl noise, which sits beneath all of my tracks. So yeah, you can't really even hear that so much. But yeah, it's just a really kind of subtle bed of vinyl noise, just to make it sound a little bit more kind of lo-fi. I've got a crash within there, which again is probably just a standard kind of 909-ish kind of crash. Yeah, kind of just a really kind of simple sample actually. I haven't even got much EQ, much effects on it, just an EQ on there, getting rid of the bit at the bottom end. I have actually done this kind of interesting thing with the beat. So, you know me, I tend to do a lot of kind of DJ effects on my tracks. And one of those is like reversing the beat. So I've taken all the beats that I've got here. So the kick, the clap, pretty much all my drums group, and I've bounced it out to audio and then I've reversed it. So you kind of get this effect. So I solo this together with that. So yeah, it's just like having that kind of DJ effect. And I tend to put a lot of that kind of stuff in there, especially scratches and stuff, which, talking of which, I do have a scratch in here. Again, I think this one was a sample. Yeah, so this is just a sample that I found off Splice, I think, mainly for convenience. Usually I go for samples just because it's quicker to get those. Of course, I can make my own samples. I can make my own scratch samples. I did a video on it actually, which I'll link in the top right-hand corner of the screen. But not always, you know, do I have the time, or I just sometimes just reach for a sample because it's just quicker. If I want to get a specific effect, then sometimes I will do it myself. But obviously, yeah, in this case, I went for a sample instead. Then we have the trusty M1. The M1, I'm using the strings from here. So if I go to here, you can see I'm using these Dyna strings. Probably would have noticed this from a previous video of a track walkthrough. I tend to use this patch quite a bit. Just a single held string, just one single held string at B4. This is how that sounds. I think this is probably faded in. It's really low within the mix, but when you kind of put everything else together, just adds a bit of atmosphere, and I kind of like that held string. It just appears in a lot of my tracks. Simple EQ, got rid of some of the bottom end, and I'm just automating the volume, so it just gently fades in. I've got it at the start of the track as well. So yeah, just really simple on that. It's just one of those textures. I tend to like texturing and layering stuff up, so you kind of have that atmosphere. Talking about atmosphere, I have this kind of air. So this is kind of like a sample of air, I guess. It's just one of those things that I kind of add. I like when you're building a track on a digital DAW like this, it can sound very clinical because all you're just dealing with is pure samples, and nowhere in life do you kind of stand there and not hear something. You're always hearing something, even if it's air or anything else like that. So that's why I kind of like putting air and effects like that within my breakdowns, so that when you do have quietness, you haven't got complete quietness. So even though there's not much going on within here, I have this kind of air going on. I got this string noise. I got the vinyl. So even if you haven't got any kind of instruments or anything else like that happening, I still have some kind of atmosphere. So this is how this sounds anyway. So you're gonna have to really struggle to hear that actually, but that's minus 40 dB in the mix, so it's really, really quiet. But it works. It's one of those things that I just kind of layer up, and even just having it at that kind of really low volume, it just adds something to it. And usually when I put this in, I will put it in, obviously it will come in at like minus 5 dB. And what I'll do is I'll take it down in volume so I can barely hear it. I want to be able to barely hear it, and then I'll just maybe notch it up a couple of dB. So then I do. So it's kind of something that sits very kind of subtly in the mix. You don't want it to kind of really stand out, unless that's the effect you're going for. I've got this build up here, which is just consisting of a white noise riser, which is just a standard one from Standard Pack. That's quite low in the mix. The main thing that's kind of making this build is this snare fill here. So yeah, snare fill there. If I go into the MIDI notes, you can see what's going on here. Loads of kind of, yeah, it's basically just a 16th 16th note pattern. I've got a swing here, so I'm using the MPC 16 Swing 66, which is quite a swingy kind of preset. It's got a lot of swing to it, and it kind of works well for these kind of snare builds. It kind of carries a lot of weight of giving it movement without it sounding too static. And then at the very end here, we got this kind of, I've halved it almost just to make it a bit quicker towards the end there. Then as far as processing goes, it is just a normal kind of snare sample, a UK garage snare sample by the sounds of it. And then I've got an auto panner on there as well. at a 1/4 rate. And basically what that's doing is it's chucking it from side to side just slightly. I've only got it about 25%. That's just chucking it from side to side. So it doesn't sound so straight and down the middle. It just has a little bit of movement, but nothing too major. I've got the auto filter there. So it comes in kind of filtered. So you can kind of see if I do the automation that it's kind of coming in quite filtered. So you get a lot of that kind of top end gone and it just gradually introduces it. I've got a reverb in there, which again is automated. So I'm not quite sure why that's not showing the automation. Oh, there's a bit of automation in here. That's quite strange. Oh, maybe because I've got the snare build here, but I don't want the reverb on that one. Okay, so there's no automation on that reverb there as such. And then I've got this EQ here, which is cutting a little bit of the bottom end out, nothing too much, but I've got this notch in here. And this notch I usually put in just to kind of get rid of some of that clarity, which sounds weird. Like you don't normally necessarily want to get rid of clarity, but making things a little bit more lo-fi, that kind of works as a method of doing that. So by taking out some of that kind of mid top end, it kind of gets rid of some of that clarity, and also it helps fit in with everything else because a lot of other stuff going on within here. I've got vocal and things like that, and because that snare, I want it to kind of sit a little bit more in the background. The scoop there that's kind of where the vocal almost sits a little bit. So that's kind of why I've got that. And I think that is pretty much it for the track. It is fairly simple. It's a kind of very kind of standard build for something that I would make. For me, it's all about kind of the little tiny details within here. Like, for example, we got this part here. So I've got the vocals. I'm using the vocals here in the first part of the track, and then I drop the vocals out, and that's when I bring in another instrument. Now, I forgot all about this because there's actually an organ in here as well. Now, the organ is the DB33, so this is also by Air as well. This organ is cool. I love this organ instrument. It doesn't always work for what I want it to be, but sometimes when I'm looking for that more traditional kind of organ, this works. So yeah, basically I had the vocal going on here, and when I dropped the vocal out, I noticed it was a bit quiet. It was kind of missing something. So rather than just it being kind of missing something, I added an organ in instead. So this is how it kind of all sounds. So the organ almost kind of replaces the vocals, and this is how the organ sounds on its own. It's a very similar setup to the Rhodes. I've got a kind of very harsh EQ on there that's getting rid of all the bottom end out, which got a really kind of large boost on the top end, again, to give it a bit of character. Reverb about the same probably as the keys. LFO tool, again, ducking it just like the keys, and the notes were set up exactly the same. So it's still using that kind of magic minor ninth chord within there. So yeah, it's kind of just replacing that vocal, and there's a whole lot of stuff that I do with the drums here as well. So I kind of take out some of the top end of the drums. Then I've got this kind of vocal sample here, little vocal sample here that just says drop it. Drop it. It was one of those things I kind of noticed there was a gap, and I thought, well, that'd be kind of cool just to put a vocal in here. So if I get rid of that vocal, you kind of hear what I mean. Yeah, I just felt like there could be something in there. Drop it. And I also I'm a big fan of those kind of hip hop vocal kind of sounds, male vocal kind of sounds, and I kind of put a lot of that kind of stuff in there. Most of the time it's kind of like percussive sounds like and and that kind of stuff, kind of add something else to the drums. But with this, I kind of really wanted something that punctuated that kind of stop. So it's on that kind of last snare of the last kick of that bar, and it just felt like it punctuated it before it going into something else. So yeah, I've got loads of those kind of little tricks that I do. I like to kind of go through once I've done a basic arrangement. I like to go through and really kind of carve stuff out. Like here, I've just carved out a very small part here, so just a kick plays on its own. So usually I'd have the crash right on the start of the bar there, but instead of that, you're kind of expecting that, and then everything drops out. So you've just got the kick happening there with the keys and the bass and everything else like that, but you're kind of, all the drums have dropped out and then they're back in again. So it's that kind of just one note, this one kick of just nothing, and then it all comes back in again. So it's just making it a little bit more unpredictable almost. Kind of, that's kind of what I usually go through, and I kind of play around with stuff just to kind of make things a bit interesting, because usually when we're making house music, it is very repetitive. So I like to kind of go through each individual bar and try and think of what I can do to make it a little bit more interesting. So that's how I made that remix. Hopefully you're still with me. I know it's a long video, but I know you guys like detail and you like to see how I make stuff and all the different layers and stuff. And of course you can jump through it if you want to, you know, where that seek bar is, you can always go to different parts of it. But yeah, hopefully it has been useful to you. I'm buzzing off this remix. I really love it, and I've been playing it in my live streams and sets and stuff. So yeah, I'm really loving it, and I really appreciate all the support I've got through so far as well, the social media messages and people saying they're supporting it. Honestly, it really means the world to me. If you want to get hold of the track, as I say, I'll put a link up there and in the description below if you want to help support it. Means a lot to me, definitely does. And also check out the rest of my channel. I've got loads more track deconstructions, tips, tricks, tutorials, loads of other stuff on there. So definitely get subscribed, hit that notification bell so you're notified the moment I upload a brand new video, and hopefully I'll see you again in the next one.